Marcus Reed, please rise.
Please rise.
Marcus Reed, for the crime of first-degree murder, this court sentences you to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole.
Every mind holds a story. Welcome to Mindfold Stories, because every person has a story, and some stories change the way you see life.
For nearly a year, one trial had divided an entire nation. For nearly a year, this city had lived beneath the shadow of one unforgettable trial. For months, cameras had followed every movement surrounding this case. But today was different. Today, everyone was waiting for one decision.
Outside those walls, families waited for an answer. For some, it was the moment they had been waiting for. For others, it was the moment they feared the most.
Some came searching for justice. Others came searching for hope. And then, the man at the center of the storm arrived. Marcus Reed had spent months hearing the same words repeated on every television screen. Guilty. The moment Marcus Reed stepped inside, the courtroom that had judged him for months finally saw him face to face. Then the room changed. Because everyone knew the next person to speak held the power to decide Marcus Reed's future. The courtroom had waited months for this morning. Now, every heartbeat seemed louder than the silence.
Marcus Reed, please rise.
Please rise.
After carefully reviewing the evidence, after hearing the testimony presented before this court,
No one moved,
this court has reached its decision.
because everyone knew what was coming next.
Marcus Reed, this court hereby sentences you, Marcus Reed, for the crime of first-degree murder. This court sentences you to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole.
Marcus Reed had prepared himself for prison, but no one can prepare for hearing the rest of their life spoken aloud.
I hereby sentence you to life.
For Evelyn Reed, justice died before her eyes.
The courtroom remained silent as Marcus was led away. He did not fight. He did not shout. He simply turned toward the woman sitting beside him, his mother, Evelyn Reed, and gave her a look that said more than words ever could. Evelyn covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. She had spent the entire trial believing that the truth would eventually save her son. But now the courtroom doors were opening, and Marcus was walking through them toward a life he knew he might never get back. Behind him, Judge Victoria Hale remained seated at the bench. Her expression was controlled, professional, unshaken. At least that was how it appeared. Because before Marcus disappeared through the doors, he stopped. He turned back toward the judge, and for one brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in his face, only disappointment. Then he was gone. Marcus disappeared through the courthouse doors that afternoon, but his real sentence began several hours later. A prison transport van carried him through miles of gray highway before stopping at a maximum security correctional facility on the outskirts of the state. By the time the outer gates opened, the sun was already disappearing. Marcus watched through the reinforced window as one steel barrier opened, then another. Beyond them stood rows of concrete buildings, razor wire fencing, floodlights, surveillance towers, and long stretches of empty pavement. There was nothing dramatic about the place. That was what frightened him. It was ordinary, permanent, the kind of place designed to make a person understand that the outside world could continue perfectly well without him. An officer ordered the prisoners out of the vehicle. Marcus stepped onto the pavement, wearing the same clothes he had worn to court. A correctional officer handed him a clear plastic property bag. Inside were the few possessions he was still legally allowed to keep. A wallet, a wedding photograph that belonged to his mother, and a small wristwatch. Everything else was taken. His fingerprints were recorded. His photograph was taken. His clothing was replaced. Then a prison uniform was placed into his hands. Orange shirt, orange pants, white prison identification number. Marcus stared at it for several seconds before putting it on. He had entered the prison as Marcus Reed. But inside those walls, he was now a number. The intake process lasted nearly 3 hours. Marcus was searched, photographed, fingerprinted, medically examined, and questioned about his history. Every answer was entered into a computer. Every possession was cataloged. Every movement was documented. It was strangely clinical. Nobody wanted to know whether he had actually committed the murder. That question had already been answered for them. The court had spoken. The paperwork had spoken. The evidence file had spoken. And the prison simply followed instructions. When Marcus finally reached his assigned housing unit, an officer walked him down a long concrete corridor lined with steel cell doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Some prisoners watched silently through narrow windows. Others shouted from inside their cells. One man laughed. Another cursed at an officer. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a metal door slammed so hard that the sound traveled through the entire floor. Marcus kept walking. His cell was small. A narrow bunk. A steel toilet. A stainless steel sink. A thin mattress. A small table bolted to the wall. He placed his property bag on the mattress and sat down. For the first time since his arrest, nobody was questioning him. Nobody was accusing him. Nobody was defending him. There was only silence. Marcus reached inside the bag and removed his mother's photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Then he noticed something. The photograph had been folded differently than when he last saw it. He unfolded it. Nothing appeared unusual. Still, Marcus remembered exactly how his mother had placed it inside his wallet before the trial. And for the first time, he wondered whether somebody had gone through his belongings after his arrest. It was a small thought, almost meaningless. But 20 years later, that memory would become important. That first night, Marcus barely slept. Every few minutes, something interrupted the silence. A distant door opened. A radio crackled. A guard's footsteps passed his cell. Someone shouted from another floor. Then, sometime after midnight, Marcus heard a violent disturbance. Metal struck concrete. Several prisoners began yelling. Correctional officers rushed down the corridor. Marcus stood beside the bars of his cell and watched as 2 officers restrained a prisoner several cells away. The incident lasted less than a minute. But afterward, Marcus understood something important. Inside prison, danger did not always announce itself. Sometimes it appeared suddenly. Sometimes it came from the person standing beside you. And sometimes it came from people wearing the same uniform as the people supposedly protecting you. The next morning, Marcus was transferred to the dining hall. Hundreds of prisoners moved through the facility in organized lines. Orange uniforms filled the room. Plastic trays slid across metal counters. Correctional officers stood along the walls. Marcus carried his tray toward an empty table. Before he could sit, another prisoner quietly told him to keep his eyes down. Marcus ignored the advice. A few minutes later, the same prisoner sat across from him. His name was Calvin. He had been incarcerated for 12 years. Calvin studied Marcus's face and then quietly told him that he had seen his case on television. Marcus asked how. Calvin said the murder had received more attention than most cases because of the people connected to it. Then he said something that Marcus had never heard during his trial. The victim had not been killed where the prosecution claimed. Marcus froze. Calvin immediately stopped talking. And before Marcus could ask another question, a correctional officer ordered Calvin to return to his assigned table. It was the first crack in the story Marcus had been given. Marcus could not forget what Calvin had said. The victim had not been killed where the prosecution claimed. That single sentence bothered him more than anything else. Because Marcus remembered the trial. He remembered the photographs. He remembered the prosecutor standing before the jury and describing the crime scene in precise detail. He remembered Detective James Carter explaining how the physical evidence supposedly placed Marcus there. And most importantly, he remembered the photograph that had convinced almost everyone in the courtroom. A photograph that appeared to show Marcus near the location of the murder. At the time, he had insisted the photograph had been taken hours before the crime. Nobody believed him. Marcus had no way to prove it. But now Calvin had given him something he had never possessed before. A reason to question the official timeline. Marcus began using every legal resource available inside the prison. He requested copies of his case documents. He studied his trial transcripts. He wrote dates on scraps of paper. He reconstructed the timeline minute by minute. The more he studied, the stranger the case became. The prosecution had relied heavily on a piece of surveillance evidence that was supposedly recovered from a storage device connected to the investigation. Marcus remembered seeing that device briefly before his arrest. He had not known what it contained. He had simply found it. But somewhere between the moment he found it and the moment detectives entered it into evidence, something had changed. A timestamp, a missing segment, and a photograph that no longer appeared exactly as he remembered it. Marcus began to suspect that the evidence had not merely been misunderstood. It had been altered. And if that was true, someone had needed Marcus to take the blame. The years did not pass quickly. They passed one morning at a time. One meal at a time. One locked door at a time. Marcus learned the prison's rhythms. He learned when the recreation yard opened. When the library became crowded. Which officers were fair. Which ones enjoyed making prisoners wait. He learned how to survive without becoming the person the prison expected him to become. That became one of his defining traits. Marcus refused to let bitterness become his identity. He started exercising in the prison gym. At first, it was simply a way to survive the anger. Eventually, it became discipline. He trained before breakfast. He read in the afternoon. And at night, he studied his case. Years later, younger prisoners would come to him for help writing appeals, understanding court documents, and preparing legal requests. Marcus never charged them anything. He simply remembered what it felt like to be powerless. But his quiet reputation also attracted attention. One afternoon in the recreation yard, a fight erupted between two prisoners. Marcus was close enough to see it begin. One prisoner shoved another. A crowd gathered. Officers rushed in. Marcus stepped backward rather than joining the chaos. A younger prisoner later asked why he had not taken sides. Marcus simply explained that he had already lost 20 years because other people had made decisions for him. He wasn't going to lose another day because he made a foolish decision himself. That sentence would become something of a rule for him. Stay alive. Stay clear. Keep the truth. And never stop looking. Because somewhere outside those prison walls, someone knew exactly what had happened that night. And Marcus began to suspect that person was still afraid of what he might eventually discover. Marcus's investigation eventually took him somewhere most prisoners rarely visited for long. The prison library. It was small, fluorescent, and painfully ordinary. But to Marcus, it became the closest thing he had to a courtroom. Every afternoon, he sat at the same table surrounded by old legal books, state statutes, appellate decisions, and copies of his own case file. He started with the evidence that had convicted him. Then he worked backward. The first thing he noticed was a discrepancy in the timeline. The prosecution had claimed that the surveillance device containing the crucial footage had been recovered from the crime scene shortly after the murder. But the property log showed something different. The device had not been formally logged until several hours later. That difference might have meant nothing. Except there was another problem. The detective who supposedly recovered it was Detective James Carter. And Carter's written report placed him at the crime scene during the exact period when another official record placed him somewhere else. Marcus read the documents again. Then again. He circled the dates. For the first time, he felt something that had been missing for years. Not hope. Not yet. Something more dangerous. A possibility. Maybe the case had never been as clean as the jury had been told. Marcus requested the original police incident report. The prison's legal department eventually provided him with a photocopy. He read it slowly. Then he noticed a sentence that made his stomach tighten. Detective Carter had written that the surveillance device was recovered from a locked office inside the victim's building. But Marcus remembered finding that device somewhere completely different. He had found it in a service hallway. He had even mentioned it during the original investigation. The detectives had dismissed the memory as confusion. Now Marcus wondered whether it had ever been confusion at all. He requested the evidence inventory. One item was listed as a digital storage device. Another listed item was a photographic envelope. Both had been entered into evidence under Carter's signature. Marcus studied the dates. The storage device had been logged at 9:47 p.m. The photographic envelope had been logged at 10:13 p.m. 26 minutes apart. But the prosecution had told the jury that both had been recovered together. Marcus stared at those 26 minutes. 26 minutes was not proof. But it was enough to ask a question. What happened during those 26 minutes? And who had access to the evidence? Marcus sent a formal request for the original chain of custody documentation. Weeks passed. No answer came. Then, unexpectedly, a prison legal clerk told him that part of the evidence record could not be located. Marcus immediately understood the significance. The missing document wasn't the evidence. It was the record showing who had controlled the evidence. Someone had not necessarily destroyed the truth. They might have simply erased the trail leading to it. Marcus began looking more closely at Detective James Carter. Carter had been the lead investigator. He had testified confidently. He had explained the evidence. He had told the jury that Marcus's movements placed him near the crime scene. For 20 years, Marcus had remembered Carter as the man who proved his guilt. Now he began wondering whether Carter had actually constructed it. Marcus requested every available report bearing Carter's name. There were dozens. Most were routine. Then he found something strange. One supplemental report had been amended 2 days after the original investigation. The amendment changed the location where the surveillance device had supposedly been discovered. That was the same location Marcus had always disputed. Marcus stared at the document. For the first time, he allowed himself to say the thought aloud. Maybe Carter had changed the story. But there was still a problem. If Carter had manipulated the evidence, why? What did he gain? Marcus had no answer. And without an answer, Carter remained only a suspect. Then another name appeared. A prosecutor. Daniel Mercer. Mercer had handled the original case. He had been known for winning difficult convictions. He had also been the person who argued that Marcus's version of events was impossible. Marcus studied Mercer's name beside Carter's. 2 men, 2 opportunities, 2 people who had controlled critical parts of the investigation. And suddenly, Marcus wondered whether the mistake had been made by one person, or whether several people had benefited from the same lie. Then, after nearly 7 years inside, Marcus received a visitor he had not expected. Detective James Carter, the man who had helped put him behind bars. Carter was older now. His hair had turned gray. His face looked heavier. But Marcus recognized him immediately. Carter sat across the glass partition in the prison visitation room. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Carter told Marcus that he had come because he had been thinking about the case. Marcus asked him why. Carter did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked whether Marcus still believed he was innocent. Marcus told him that he had never stopped believing it. Carter looked down. Then he admitted something unsettling. He said there had been pressure during the original investigation. Marcus asked from whom. Carter refused to give a name. He only said that the case had to be solved quickly. Then he said something even more disturbing. He told Marcus that there was one piece of evidence he had never personally examined. Marcus asked how that was possible if Carter had been the lead detective. Carter said the evidence had been transferred before he could review it. Marcus immediately asked where it had gone. Carter stood up. The conversation was over. Before leaving, he looked at Marcus through the glass and quietly told him that if he ever found the original evidence inventory, he should pay attention to the number of storage devices listed. Then Carter walked away. Marcus remained seated. He had just received the strangest information of his entire investigation. And he still didn't know whether Carter had come to help him, or to see how much he knew. Carter's visit changed the direction of Marcus's investigation. If Carter had not examined every piece of evidence, then someone else had. Marcus returned to the case files. He searched for every reference to evidence transfers. Eventually, he found a name that had barely appeared during the original trial. Daniel Mercer, the prosecutor. Mercer had personally requested access to several pieces of digital evidence before the trial. That alone was not suspicious. Prosecutors routinely reviewed evidence. But the timing was strange. Mercer had accessed the case materials less than 24 hours before the final evidence inventory was submitted. Marcus began wondering whether Mercer had seen something before the defense ever knew it existed. Then came another discovery. One of the original witnesses had changed her statement. Her first statement placed Marcus several miles away from the crime scene at the approximate time of the murder. Her second statement placed him near the building. The second statement was the one the prosecution used. Marcus searched for an explanation. There wasn't one. The witness had later disappeared from public records. She had moved out of state. Nobody knew where she was. Marcus now had three possibilities: Detective Carter, Prosecutor Daniel Mercer, or the witness who had changed her story. Three people, three pieces of the puzzle. But Marcus still didn't know that all three were connected by something far more important: a missing piece of digital evidence. And that evidence had been sitting somewhere outside the courtroom for nearly 20 years. By the 10th year, Marcus had changed. Not because prison had broken him, because he had finally learned how to survive it. He woke before dawn. He exercised. He read. He studied. And he kept his emotions under control. The prison gym became part of his routine. There were no luxuries. Just old weight machines, metal benches, worn exercise equipment, and rows of prisoners moving through their routines beneath the watch of correctional officers. Marcus trained quietly. He never tried to become the strongest man in the room. He trained because discipline gave him something the prison could not take away: control. One morning, while Marcus was finishing a workout, Calvin approached him. Calvin looked nervous. He told Marcus that he had remembered something from the first year they had met. At the time, Marcus had ignored it because he was too overwhelmed. But Calvin had once worked in the prison laundry with a man who had previously been employed by the county evidence facility. That man had told Calvin something strange. Several years before Marcus's conviction, evidence from a major homicide case had been transferred out of the normal storage system. Calvin couldn't remember the case number, but he remembered one detail. The storage container had been marked for digital evidence. Marcus stopped exercising. He asked Calvin whether he knew who had authorized the transfer. Calvin shook his head, but he remembered the man's description. And then he remembered something else. The person who collected the evidence had not been a police officer. It had been a private courier. Marcus immediately understood the significance. Someone outside the police department had handled part of the evidence. And that person had never been mentioned during his trial. Marcus requested another round of legal records. This time, he wasn't looking for Carter. He wasn't looking for Mercer. He was looking for the courier. The search produced almost nothing. There was no complete name, no photograph, no official testimony, just a contractor reference buried inside an old administrative document. The company had handled secure transportation for government agencies. Marcus searched the company name through old newspaper archives available in the prison library. Then he found something. The company had been investigated years earlier for improperly documenting the movement of sensitive materials. The investigation had never resulted in criminal charges. But one employee had resigned abruptly. His name was Richard Vale. Marcus wrote the name down. Then he compared it with the date of the evidence transfer. Vale had worked for the company at exactly the right time. But that still didn't prove anything. Marcus needed more. He requested archive transportation records. The prison clerk told him those records had been destroyed according to retention policy. Marcus almost gave up. Then he noticed something. The destruction date came years before the official retention period should have ended. That was impossible, unless someone had authorized the destruction early. Marcus sat back in his chair. He had started with a wrongful conviction. Now he was looking at missing evidence, altered records, unexplained transfers, a changed witness statement, and a private courier whose records had mysteriously disappeared. The case was becoming too complicated to be an accident. Marcus eventually discovered something that changed everything. The courier, Richard Vale, had not disappeared. He had simply changed his name. Marcus found an old business registration connecting Vale to another company. And that company had one major client, the state prosecutor's office. Marcus stared at the record. He checked the dates. The company had been created shortly after the murder, and Richard Vale had become one of its directors within months. That meant the man who had transported sensitive evidence had later established a business relationship with the very office that prosecuted Marcus. Marcus felt the room around him become strangely quiet. For 20 years, he had believed his conviction had been built by police evidence. Now he was beginning to understand that the evidence had traveled through private hands. But there was still something missing. Why would anyone go to that much trouble to frame him? Marcus returned to the original case. He studied the victim. He studied the victim's business connections. Then he found a name he had never heard during his trial. Samuel Reed, Marcus's own father. Marcus had been told his father had died years before the murder. But according to an old financial record, Samuel Reed had been involved in a business dispute with the victim. The dispute had ended months before the murder. Or so Marcus had believed. The documents suggested otherwise. The two men had been negotiating something privately shortly before the killing. And Marcus had never been told. For the first time, the case became personal in a completely different way. Maybe Marcus had not been chosen randomly. Maybe his family had been connected to the motive all along. Marcus spent the next several weeks trying to understand what his father had been involved in. Samuel Reed had been a quiet man. Marcus remembered him as someone who avoided confrontation. A father who worked long hours. A man who rarely discussed business at home. But the records suggested that Samuel had known the victim far better than Marcus had realized. There had been money involved, a property dispute, and a contract. Marcus discovered that his father had attempted to withdraw from a business arrangement shortly before the murder. Then he found something even more disturbing. The victim had threatened to expose Samuel's involvement in a financial scheme. Marcus stared at the documents for hours. Suddenly, his father's death looked different. Samuel had supposedly died of natural causes before Marcus's conviction. But the timing was close enough to make Marcus suspicious. He requested his father's death records. The medical report contained no evidence of foul play. Yet one detail bothered him. The physician who signed the report had also appeared as a consultant in the original murder investigation. Marcus couldn't prove the connection, but the number of coincidences was becoming impossible to ignore. Then, one evening, Marcus received a letter from his mother. She told him there was something she had never told him about his father. Something she had kept secret because she had been afraid. She said Samuel had visited her shortly before his death, and he had told her that if anything happened to him, she should never trust the people investigating the murder. Marcus read that sentence again and again. For 20 years, his mother had carried that secret alone. And now Marcus finally understood why. She had been afraid that telling the truth would make him a target too. Marcus was still processing his mother's revelation when the prison erupted again. It happened during evening recreation. A fight broke out near the far end of the courtyard. This time, Marcus recognized one of the men involved. It was a prisoner named Leon Grant. Leon had spent years working in the prison maintenance department. He was known for keeping to himself. But that evening, Leon was dragged into a violent confrontation with another inmate. Officers rushed into the yard. The prisoners were ordered to the ground. Marcus stepped away from the chaos. Then Leon looked directly at him. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Leon shouted something Marcus could barely hear. He told Marcus to ask about the old county evidence warehouse. Then the officers pulled him away. Marcus stood frozen. That phrase made no sense. The warehouse had never appeared in his trial. Yet it was now the second time someone connected to the prison had pointed him toward a place outside the official evidence chain. Later that night, Leon was moved to another housing unit. Marcus tried to find out why. No one would tell him. The following morning, he discovered that Leon had requested protective custody. Marcus knew then that something was changing. People were becoming nervous. And if prisoners inside a maximum security facility were beginning to whisper about the same evidence warehouse Marcus had been investigating, then perhaps the secret had survived for 20 years because someone had worked very hard to keep it buried. Marcus couldn't get Leon's words out of his mind. The old county evidence warehouse. The following morning, Marcus requested access to the prison's legal archives again. This time, he wasn't looking for a name. He was looking for a location. The county had once maintained an off-site evidence facility for cases that required long-term storage. Marcus searched old court documents and discovered something he had never seen in the original trial. The murder case had an evidence storage reference number. That number did not correspond to the main police evidence room. It corresponded to the old county warehouse. Marcus sat back. For the first time, he had something concrete. The warehouse had existed. The case had been connected to it. And the original evidence had apparently passed through it. But why had nobody mentioned it in court? Marcus requested the warehouse records. The response came 3 weeks later. The facility had been closed. Its records had been transferred, and most of the physical evidence had supposedly been destroyed. Marcus nearly laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because every time he got close to the truth, another door seemed to close. But then he noticed the wording. Most of the physical evidence. Not all. Marcus immediately requested clarification. The legal clerk told him that some materials had been transferred to a private storage facility before the warehouse closed. Marcus asked who authorized the transfer. The clerk searched the old records. Then she looked up. She told him there was a signature. A signature belonging to someone Marcus had never suspected. The signature belonged to someone Marcus knew. Someone who had been present throughout the original trial. Someone who had never appeared on the list of suspects. It belonged to the assistant district attorney who had helped prosecutor Daniel Mercer prepare the case. Her name was Elena Price. Marcus remembered her. She had sat behind Mercer during almost every major hearing. She had organized documents. She had spoken with witnesses. She had handled evidence requests. But she had never testified. Marcus went back through the trial transcript. There she was. Mentioned only a handful of times. Almost invisible. Marcus requested her employment records. Elena Price had left the prosecutor's office shortly after Marcus was convicted. She had moved into private legal consulting. Then, years later, she became a senior executive at a company specializing in evidence management technology. Marcus stared at the information. The woman who had helped organize the evidence against him had eventually built a career around managing evidence. That was too strange to ignore. But then came the twist. Eleanor Price had not signed the transfer order alone. There was a second signature beneath hers. And Marcus recognized that name too. Detective James Carter. For the first time, two of his suspects appeared on the same document. Carter, Price, both had authorized the transfer of evidence from the county warehouse. Marcus's hands tightened around the paper. Maybe they weren't separate suspects after all. Maybe they had been working together. Marcus could not physically visit the warehouse. But someone else could. His attorney, who had remained in contact with him for years, agreed to investigate. The old facility had been abandoned for nearly a decade. Part of the building had been demolished. Another section had been converted into commercial storage units. The attorney visited the property with a retired county records officer. They discovered that the original warehouse basement had survived. And inside that basement were shelves containing old storage labels that had never been properly cataloged. Most were empty. Some were damaged. But one shelf contained a collection of sealed evidence containers. The attorney photographed everything. Then he found the number. The same number that appeared in Marcus's case. The container was still there. 20 years later. Nobody had destroyed it. Nobody had logged it. Nobody had mentioned it. The attorney called Marcus immediately. Marcus listened in stunned silence. Then his attorney told him something that made his heart race. The seal on the container appeared to be original. If the contents were intact, they could finally answer the question Marcus had been asking for 2 decades. What exactly had been removed from the evidence chain? And who had done it? But before the container could be opened, the attorney noticed something else. The seal had a second marking beneath the original evidence label. A private security company code. The same company once associated with Richard Vale. The Courier. Marcus suddenly realized the investigation had come full circle. The container was transported under court supervision. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus's original evidence was going to be examined again. The defense attorney requested an independent forensic specialist. The prosecutor's office objected. That objection immediately raised another question. Why would the prosecution fight to prevent evidence from being tested? The judge overseeing the new proceedings rejected the objection. The container was opened. Inside were several items. An old digital storage device. A damaged photographic envelope. A printed evidence inventory. And a small piece of hardware Marcus had never seen before. The forensic specialist began examining the materials. The digital device was badly outdated, but it still contained recoverable data. The specialist managed to extract fragments, video files, metadata, deleted timestamps, and one corrupted recording. The recording appeared to come from the night of the murder. Marcus's attorney watched it first. Then he stopped the playback. He had seen something in the background. A vehicle, a person, and a location that did not match the prosecution's original timeline. The video was not complete, but it was enough to prove one thing. Marcus had been telling the truth about the timeline. He had not been where the prosecution said he was. The courtroom had been built around a false sequence of events. But the biggest discovery had not yet appeared. The forensic specialist recovered one final file. Its timestamp was several hours earlier than the official evidence log. Someone had accessed the device before the police officially recovered it. Someone had opened the evidence, and someone had deleted part of the recording. The recovered footage was only 38 seconds long. But those 38 seconds changed the case. The camera showed the rear service entrance of the victim's building. Marcus appeared nowhere. Instead, another vehicle entered the area. A dark sedan. The timestamp placed it at the exact period when Marcus was supposedly committing the murder. The sedan stopped. A man stepped out. The footage was grainy. His face could not be identified. But the forensic specialist noticed something else. The vehicle's license plate was partially visible. They enhanced the image. The number matched a vehicle registered to a company connected to the victim. Marcus's attorney immediately began investigating the company. Then they discovered that the company had once employed Richard Vale, the courier, the same man connected to the evidence transfer. But Richard Vale was not the owner. He had been working for someone else, someone whose name had been buried behind layers of corporate records. And that person was connected to Daniel Mercer, the prosecutor. The mystery suddenly became much larger than Marcus's conviction. Someone had a reason to kill the victim. Someone had a reason to manipulate the evidence. And someone had a reason to make Marcus look guilty. But there was still one question nobody could answer. Who was the man who stepped out of that sedan? And why had someone spent 20 years making sure nobody saw those 38 seconds? The answer was sitting inside the recovered evidence. But before they could reveal it, the forensic specialist discovered that the original video had been deliberately edited. Someone had not simply deleted footage. They had tried to make the remaining footage tell a completely different story. And suddenly, the case wasn't just about proving Marcus innocent. It was about discovering who had controlled the truth from the beginning. The forensic specialist slowed the recovered footage down frame by frame. At normal speed, it looked like nothing more than a vehicle arriving behind the building. But when they examined the metadata, the truth became harder to ignore. The file had been modified. Not once, twice. The original recording had been copied onto another device before the official police inventory was created. The specialist recovered fragments of the original file structure and reconstructed part of what had been removed. The missing section lasted just over 11 minutes. Those 11 minutes were enough to completely change the timeline. Marcus had not been inside the building during that period. Someone else had. And the vehicle had remained parked behind the building. The specialist enhanced the footage again. This time, the man's face became slightly clearer. Still not enough for identification. But his clothing was visible. A dark jacket, light shirt, and something in his right hand. A rectangular object. The forensic specialist enlarged it. It looked like a digital storage device. Marcus's attorney immediately compared the shape with photographs of the evidence device from the original case. They appeared almost identical. That meant the person in the footage may have been carrying the very device that later became the centerpiece of Marcus's conviction. The implication was enormous. The evidence may not have been discovered after the murder. It may have been carried into the building before the police ever arrived. Someone could have planted it. And if that was true, the entire chain of evidence had been manufactured from the beginning. The license plate gave investigators their first concrete lead. The dark sedan belonged to a company called Northbridge Security Services. The company had provided private transportation and evidence security services to several government agencies. Richard Vale had worked there. But when the attorney searched the company's ownership records, another name appeared. Eleanor Price, the former assistant district attorney. She had not owned the company directly. Instead, she had become a silent partner through an investment firm. That discovery immediately raised the possibility that Price had known more about the evidence than she had admitted. But Marcus's attorney wasn't satisfied. He traced the company's records further. Northbridge Security Services had been contracted by the county only 3 months before the murder. Its first major assignment: transporting sensitive evidence from the county warehouse. The same warehouse where Marcus's evidence had been stored. Suddenly, Richard Vale's involvement made sense. He had not been an ordinary courier. He had been part of the private company responsible for transporting evidence. And Alina Price had been financially connected to that company. But there was still something missing. Why would a prosecutor's assistant secretly invest in an evidence transport company? The attorney searched further. Then he found a payment. A large payment, made just days after Marcus was convicted. The money had come from a company controlled by Daniel Mercer, the prosecutor. At that moment, the investigation appeared to point directly toward Mercer. But Marcus's attorney refused to stop there. Because the payment had been made through 3 separate accounts. And the final recipient wasn't Alina Price. It was someone else. When Marcus's attorney finally explained what they had discovered, Marcus did not celebrate. He became more cautious. He had spent too many years learning that evidence could be manipulated. He asked one question: who received the money? His attorney told him they were still investigating. Marcus immediately reminded him that they should not assume Mercer was guilty simply because the money appeared to lead back to him. That was another trait Marcus had developed inside prison: patience. He had learned that suspicion was not proof, and he refused to replace one false accusation with another. The investigation continued. Then the attorney discovered that the final payment had gone to a trust. The trust was controlled by a retired judge, a man named Thomas Whitmore. Marcus recognized the name immediately. Judge Whitmore had not presided over his trial, but he had been the senior administrative judge responsible for assigning judges to major criminal cases in that district. And 20 years earlier, he had been one of Victoria Hale's mentors. Marcus's attorney went silent. Suddenly, the investigation had reached the judiciary. Not necessarily Judge Hale, but someone who had influenced her career. Someone who had access to the court system. Someone who could potentially influence how sensitive evidence was handled. Marcus looked through the glass during their prison visit. He told his attorney not to accuse anyone without proof. Then he said something that would later become crucial. If the truth had survived for 20 years, it would survive another week. What mattered now was finding the entire truth, not just the part that proved him innocent. While Marcus was rebuilding the case from behind prison walls, Victoria Hale had spent 20 years believing the case was finished. She had continued her career. She had presided over thousands of hearings. She had sentenced criminals. She had released others. She had become known for being firm, careful, and almost impossible to intimidate. But there was one case she rarely discussed: Marcus Reed. She remembered his mother's tears. She remembered Marcus turning around before the courtroom doors closed. And she remembered the strange calm in his eyes. Over the years, she had told herself that memory was simply the burden judges carried. Every difficult sentence left something behind. Then one afternoon, an envelope arrived at her home. There was no dramatic warning, no threatening message, just a legal document, a request for review of an old conviction. Victoria opened it. The first pages described newly discovered evidence. The second section described inconsistencies in the original chain of custody. Then she saw Marcus Reed's name. She stopped reading. For the first time in 20 years, the case was no longer a memory. It was back in front of her. And this time, she was not reading it from the bench. She was reading it as someone who might have been wrong. Victoria continued. Then she reached the section describing the recovered surveillance footage. Her face changed. She read the same paragraph twice. Then she reached for the original case file. She wanted to see the evidence herself. And when she compared the original timeline with the newly recovered footage, she realized something terrifying. The evidence she had relied upon 20 years earlier could not possibly have been accurate. Victoria went into her private records that evening. She found the original sentencing documents. Then she found her handwritten notes from the trial. She remembered the evidence. She remembered the prosecutor's argument. She remembered why she had believed Marcus was guilty. But one detail suddenly felt wrong. The photograph. Victoria had written a note beside it. She had questioned the timestamp. She remembered asking whether the image had been independently verified. The prosecutor had assured her that it had. But there was no record of that verification in her notes. Victoria searched the original file. Nothing. She searched the evidence inventory. Nothing. Then she found the name of the person who had delivered the photograph to the courtroom. Eleanor Price. Victoria stared at the name. She remembered Price sitting behind the prosecutor. She remembered her calm efficiency. She remembered how quickly the documents had appeared whenever the prosecution requested something. And then another memory surfaced. A conversation she had almost completely forgotten. 20 years earlier, after the sentencing, Price had approached her outside the courtroom. She had told Victoria that the case was finally over. At the time, Victoria had thought nothing of it. Now the words sounded different. Almost rehearsed. Victoria closed the file. For the first time in her career, she felt something she had spent decades warning other people about. Doubt. Not doubt about Marcus. Doubt about herself. Had she delivered justice that day? Or had she simply accepted a story that had been carefully prepared for her? Victoria picked up the phone. She called the courthouse archives. She asked for every surviving document connected to the Marcus Reed case. Then she gave one instruction. Nothing was to be removed. Nothing was to be copied. And nothing was to be destroyed. Because 20 years after she sentenced Marcus, Judge Victoria Hale had finally begun investigating her own verdict. The courthouse archives were opened the following morning. Victoria arrived before sunrise. She did not come as a judge. She came as a woman trying to understand a decision she had made 20 years earlier. The archivist brought out the original boxes. One by one, they were placed on the table. Trial transcripts, evidence inventories, photographs, witness statements, police reports, and finally, the original chain of custody documents. Victoria went through everything herself. She compared the dates. Then she noticed something she had never seen before. There was a gap. The evidence had been logged into police custody at 11:42 p.m. But another document showed that the same evidence had already been transferred from the county warehouse at 10:58 p.m. 44 minutes were missing. 44 minutes when nobody could officially explain where the evidence had been. Victoria stared at the page. Then she checked the signature. It was Eleanor Price's. But beneath it was another signature. Richard Vale, the private courier. Victoria immediately asked the archivist whether there were any additional records. The archivist hesitated. He said there was one box that had never been digitized. It had been placed in a restricted archive decades earlier. Victoria asked why. The archivist told her the box had been marked Administrative Review. Victoria knew exactly what that meant. Someone had deliberately separated those records from the main case file. She ordered the box brought upstairs, and inside it was something nobody had expected to survive. The original evidence transfer receipt. The receipt changed the investigation. It showed that the evidence had been transferred at 10:58 p.m. But the prosecution had told the court that police officers recovered it directly from the crime scene at 11:42. Those two statements could not both be true. Victoria read the receipt again. The transfer had been authorized by Eleanor Price. The courier had been Richard Vale. And the destination had not been the police evidence room. It had been a private storage facility. Victoria's hands began to tremble. She remembered the original trial. She remembered seeing the evidence. She remembered believing it had been recovered by police. But according to this receipt, that was impossible. Someone had changed the story before it ever reached her courtroom. Victoria immediately contacted the current district attorney. She told him that the Marcus Reed conviction needed an emergency review. The district attorney asked whether she was certain. Victoria paused. Then she answered that she was certain of one thing. She could no longer defend the original timeline. Within hours, the court scheduled an emergency hearing. The news spread quickly. Marcus's name appeared in newspapers again. For the first time in 20 years, people began asking the question nobody had asked loudly enough before. What if Marcus Reed had been innocent all along? But while the public focused on Marcus, another person was watching the news. Daniel Mercer, the prosecutor who had secured the conviction. He saw the headline. Then he saw Victoria Hale's name. And his expression changed. Because Mercer knew something the public didn't. He knew exactly what was inside that missing evidence box. Daniel Mercer had spent 20 years telling himself the past was finished. He was now a respected senior attorney. His hair had turned gray. His voice had become softer. His suits had become more expensive. And the courtroom prosecutor who once pursued Marcus Reed was now regarded by many people as a brilliant legal strategist. But when he saw Victoria Hale reopening the case, the confidence disappeared. Mercer went into his private office. He locked the door. Then he called Eleanor Price. She answered immediately. Mercer asked whether she had heard the news. She said she had. He asked whether the old warehouse records still existed. There was a long silence. Then Eleanor told him that they had been destroyed years ago. Mercer reminded her that he wasn't asking about the official records. He was asking about everything else. Eleanor became defensive. She told him they had done what they had to do 20 years earlier. Mercer suddenly lowered his voice. He told her that if the receipt had survived, other things could have survived too. Neither of them knew that their conversation was being recorded. The current district attorney had authorized investigators to examine every surviving communication connected to the case. And now, for the first time, investigators had something far more valuable than suspicion. They had panic. Mercer and Price had not confessed. But their conversation suggested they both knew exactly which evidence could destroy them. Then Mercer made a mistake. He mentioned a name that had never appeared in Marcus's trial. Thomas Whitmore. 3 days later, Marcus Reed was brought back into the courthouse. He had not walked through those doors in 20 years. The same marble floors were still there. The same high ceilings. The same wooden benches. But Marcus was different. His hair was shorter. His face was harder, and the orange prison uniform made the contrast even more painful. He was escorted into the courtroom in restraints. The gallery was packed. Journalists sat behind the defense table. Legal observers filled the benches. Marcus's mother sat in the front row. She was older now. Her hands trembled as she watched her son enter. Then Marcus looked toward the judge's bench. Victoria Hale was not presiding. She had voluntarily removed herself from the hearing because of her connection to the original case. Instead, another judge sat there. The prosecutor presented the newly discovered evidence. The defense presented the warehouse receipt. Then came the surveillance footage. The courtroom watched the dark sedan arrive behind the victim's building. Nobody spoke. The timestamp was displayed. Marcus could not have been there. The prosecution's original timeline collapsed in less than a minute. Marcus looked at his mother. She covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. For 20 years, she had told people her son was innocent. Now the courtroom was finally seeing why. But then the defense attorney announced something even more explosive. They had identified the company that owned the vehicle, and the company's financial records connected directly to Daniel Mercer. The courtroom erupted. The judge ordered everyone to remain silent. Marcus simply sat there. He had spent 20 years waiting for someone to believe him. And now, for the first time, the evidence was speaking for him. The judge called for order. But the atmosphere had already changed. The prosecution could no longer rely on the original timeline. The defense had demonstrated that the evidence had passed through a private company before reaching police custody. The surveillance footage placed another vehicle at the crime scene, and financial records connected that company to people involved in the original prosecution. The judge asked the prosecution one question. Could they explain the 44-minute gap? The prosecutor stood. He looked through the documents. Then he admitted that they could not. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Marcus closed his eyes. Not in celebration. In exhaustion. For 20 years, he had imagined this moment. He had imagined shouting. He had imagined demanding apologies. Instead, he simply breathed. His mother reached across the aisle and touched his hand. The judge then ordered investigators to locate every person connected to the original evidence transfer. That included Richard Vale, Eleanor Price, Daniel Mercer, and Thomas Whitmore. 4 names, 4 possible connections. But only one person knew what had actually happened that night. And investigators were about to find him. Because Richard Vale had not disappeared. He had been living under his real name in another state for nearly 2 decades. And when investigators finally located him, he agreed to talk. But he had one condition. He would only tell the truth if Judge Victoria Hale was in the room. Richard Vale had spent 19 years living quietly in a small town outside Phoenix. He had changed jobs several times. He had remarried. He had grown older. And as far as his neighbors knew, he was simply Richard Vale, a retired transportation contractor who enjoyed gardening and watching baseball. Nobody knew about the murder case. Nobody knew that his name appeared on one of the most important evidence transfer documents in the county's history. When investigators finally arrived at his house, Richard did not run. He opened the door. He looked at the investigators. Then he asked one question. How long did it take you to find me? The lead investigator told him almost 20 years. Richard gave a tired smile. He said that was about right. They asked him about Marcus Reed. Richard looked toward the ground. Then he invited them inside. The interview lasted nearly 4 hours. At first, Richard denied knowing anything about the murder. He claimed he had only transported evidence. He said he never opened containers. He said he never questioned police instructions. But when investigators showed him the old warehouse receipt, his entire demeanor changed. He stared at his own signature. Then he admitted something. He had lied 20 years earlier. He had not simply transported the evidence. He had been ordered to collect it from a private location. And the person who gave him the order was not the police. It was someone from the prosecutor's office. But Richard refused to name that person. Instead, he said he would only tell the entire story if Victoria Hale was present. The investigators asked Richard why he had waited 20 years. He said because he was afraid. Not of prison. Not anymore. He was afraid of the people who had hired him. Richard explained that 20 years earlier he had been struggling financially. His private security company had been close to bankruptcy. Then an opportunity appeared. A large contract. Private evidence transportation. The money was good. The instructions were simple. Pick up sealed materials. Transport them. Do not open them. Do not ask questions. Richard said he followed those instructions for months. Until the night of Marcus Reed's case. That night he received a phone call. He was told to drive to a private building instead of the police station. He arrived shortly after 11. A man was waiting outside. Richard said the man was not wearing a police uniform. He was carrying a sealed evidence container. Richard took it. Then the man gave him another instruction. He was told to remove one item from the container before delivering it. Richard refused. The man reminded him how much money he had already received. Then he reminded Richard that his company could lose its contract. Richard eventually opened the container. Inside was the evidence that would later become central to Marcus's conviction. But there was something else. A small digital recording device. Richard was instructed to keep it separate. He said he did exactly that. Then years later, he realized why. The recording contained something that could have destroyed the entire case. Richard finally looked at the investigators. He told them he still knew where it was. The investigators expected Richard to say he had buried the device. He hadn't. He had kept it. For 20 years. Richard told them that after the trial, guilt began eating away at him. He couldn't undo what had happened. But he could refuse to destroy the final piece of evidence. So he hid it. Not in a bank. Not in a safe. Not underground. He placed it inside an old metal toolbox in his garage. Then he never touched it again. Investigators followed him home. Richard walked slowly into the garage. He opened a cabinet. Behind several old tools sat a battered metal toolbox covered in dust. Richard removed it. His hands were shaking. He opened the lid. Inside were old photographs, receipts, a broken flashlight, and beneath them, a small black digital recording device. The investigators immediately secured the area. Richard told them he had never listened to the entire recording. He had been too afraid. The device was transported to the forensic laboratory. When specialists examined it, they discovered something extraordinary. The recording had been made on the night of the murder. And unlike the surveillance footage, it had not been edited. It contained audio. Voices. Several voices. One belonged to the victim. Another belonged to a man. And then, near the end of the recording, someone said a name. a name the audience had heard before, but not in the way they expected. The forensic laboratory worked through the night. The device was damaged. The battery was dead. Part of the storage system had deteriorated, but the recording survived. Technicians extracted the audio. At first, there was only static. Then footsteps. A door opening. A man's voice. The victim speaking. The forensic team increased the clarity. The conversation became understandable. The victim was arguing with someone. She accused the man of stealing money. She threatened to expose him. The man became angry. Then another voice entered the room. That second voice was what changed everything. It was not Richard Vale. It was not Daniel Mercer. And it was not Detective Carter. It was Thomas Whitmore, the retired judge, the man who had controlled judicial assignments 20 years earlier. The investigators listened in silence. Whitmore had been there that night. But the recording revealed something even more disturbing. The victim had known him. She called him by name. Then she said something that explained why she had been killed. She told Whitmore that she had discovered what he and another person had been doing with evidence from high-profile criminal cases. She had threatened to expose them. Then the recording captured a loud crash. The audio ended. The room went silent. The investigators looked at one another. They finally understood. Marcus had never been the target. He had been the solution. Someone needed a person to blame. And Marcus had been placed exactly where they needed him. The recording did not prove everything, but it proved enough to reopen the entire investigation. Thomas Whitmore had been present. The victim had confronted him, and she had accused him of manipulating criminal evidence. But the investigators still needed to know who had been helping him. Then they isolated another section of the audio. A voice appeared in the background. The recording was faint, almost impossible to hear, but the forensic specialist enhanced it. The voice said one sentence. It was an instruction. A short one. Make sure Reed takes the fall. Marcus's name. The room went silent. They played it again. Then again. There was no doubt. Someone had specifically discussed Marcus before the evidence was planted. But the speaker's identity remained unclear. Investigators compared the voice against archived recordings. First, they tested Daniel Mercer. The result was inconclusive. Then Detective Carter. Also inconclusive. Then Alina Price. The match was stronger, but still not enough for court. Finally, they tested Thomas Whitmore. The result was not a perfect match. But the investigators noticed something else. The voice on the recording did not sound like the older Whitmore. It sounded 20 years younger. They needed an old recording. They searched historical courtroom archives and eventually found one. Thomas Whitmore speaking during a judicial conference 21 years earlier. The forensic system compared the voices. This time, the result was dramatically different. The match was strong. But before investigators could celebrate, they discovered something that made the case even more complicated. Whitmore had not been alone. Another voice could be heard whispering beside him. And that voice belonged to someone nobody had suspected. Someone who had been sitting in the courtroom the entire time Marcus was sentenced. Someone who had watched Victoria Hale pronounce the life sentence. Someone who had walked out of the courthouse that day, believing the secret would remain buried forever. The investigation had reached its final suspect. And when investigators finally placed that person's name on the case board, even Marcus's attorney couldn't believe it. The original police report contained a detail Marcus had forgotten. On the night of the murder, Marcus had been seen near the victim's neighborhood. That part was true, but investigators had never asked why he was there. Marcus had been working a temporary delivery job at the time. One of his deliveries had taken him to a nearby building. The delivery receipt placed him there for less than 20 minutes. That innocent coincidence had become the foundation of the prosecution's story. But the defense attorney dug deeper. The delivery company had kept route records, and those records revealed something extraordinary. Marcus's route had been changed that afternoon. Not by Marcus, not by his supervisor. Someone had called the company and requested the route adjustment. The request had come from a number connected to a private legal office. A legal office connected to a leaner price. Marcus had unknowingly been sent into the neighborhood where the murder would later occur. That meant someone had potentially placed him there. Not after the murder. Before it. The attorney requested the original call records. They were still available. The number had been disconnected years earlier, but the account holder was still listed. A leaner price. Marcus's attorney sat back. For 20 years, everyone had assumed Marcus had been unlucky. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the evidence suggested something much darker. He had been deliberately placed in the right place at the right time. Then came the question that changed everything. Who knew Marcus would be there? The answer appeared in an old email recovered from the delivery company. It had been sent the morning of the murder. The sender had written only one sentence. Make sure Reed's route stays on schedule. Someone had planned for Marcus to be there. When Marcus heard what they had discovered, he said nothing for several seconds. Then he asked to see the route records. His attorney showed him the documents. Marcus studied them carefully. He remembered that day. He remembered receiving the route change. At the time, he had thought nothing of it. He had been young. He had been trying to earn enough money to help his mother. He had simply followed instructions. Now he realized someone may have been moving him like a piece on a chessboard. Marcus leaned back. He remembered something else. That afternoon, a stranger had approached him outside one of the delivery locations. The man had asked whether Marcus was the driver assigned to the area. Marcus had said yes. The man had walked away. Marcus had forgotten the encounter for 20 years. Now the memory returned with frightening clarity. He described the man. Dark jacket. Tall. Silver watch. A small scar near his left eyebrow. The investigators compared the description with photographs from the original investigation. One person matched. Richard Vale. Marcus suddenly understood why Richard had been so afraid. The courier had not discovered the evidence afterward. He had been part of the operation from the beginning. But Richard had not been the mastermind. He had been the person carrying out instructions. Marcus asked one question. Who gave Richard those instructions? The answer was almost within reach. Then Richard called the investigators. He said there was something else he had never told them. A second meeting. The night before the murder. And at that meeting, Richard had seen the person who gave him the final instructions. He knew exactly who it was. Richard's second statement was even more disturbing. The night before the murder, he had been called to a private parking garage. He arrived shortly after midnight. The garage was almost empty. Richard waited beside his vehicle. Then a black sedan entered. Two people stepped out. Richard recognized one immediately. Thomas Whitmore. The second person remained partially hidden in the shadows. Whitmore handed Richard an envelope. Inside was a photograph of Marcus. Richard had asked why they were interested in him. Whitmore told him that Marcus was going to become part of the investigation. Richard asked what that meant. Whitmore told him not to ask questions. Then the second person stepped forward. Richard recognized her. Eleanor Price. She told Richard that the most important thing was making sure the evidence pointed toward Marcus. Richard said he was shocked. He asked whether Marcus was actually involved. Price reportedly told him that it didn't matter. The case needed a clean suspect. Someone without political connections. Someone who could not fight back. Someone whose life could be sacrificed without attracting too much attention. Marcus was perfect. Richard said that was the moment he understood what he had become involved in. He wanted to walk away. But Whitmore reminded him that his company had received a government contract because of their connections. If Richard talked, the contract would disappear. And so would his business. Richard obeyed. For 20 years he carried the guilt. But now the truth was finally coming out. There was only one thing left. Why did Whitmore want the victim dead in the first place? The investigators finally had a picture of the conspiracy. But they still didn't have the motive. Why kill the victim? Why manipulate the evidence? Why destroy Marcus's life? The answer came from the victim's financial records. She had been investigating suspicious transfers involving several private companies. Money had been moving through shell corporations. Government contracts had been redirected. Evidence storage contracts had been inflated. And judges, prosecutors, private security companies, and political donors had all appeared in the same financial network. The victim had discovered it. She had threatened to expose it. Thomas Whitmore had been one of the people she confronted. But the financial records revealed something even larger. Whitmore wasn't the person receiving the money. He was protecting someone else. Someone at the top. Someone who had never been publicly connected to the case. The investigators followed the money through another company. Then another. Finally, they reached a private foundation. The foundation had been established more than 20 years earlier. Its largest donor was a powerful businessman. A man whose name had appeared once in the original investigation. And then mysteriously disappeared. The investigators pulled his photograph. Richard Vale identified him immediately. He said the man had been present during the secret parking garage meeting. He was the person who had remained inside the second vehicle. The man who had never stepped fully into the light. And when the investigators placed his photograph on the evidence board, everyone in the room went silent. Because this was the person who had ordered the entire operation. And unlike Whitmore, Mercer, Price, and Vale, he had never spent a single day in prison. He had spent 20 years becoming more powerful. Now Marcus Reed was finally getting close to the person who had destroyed his life. And the next hearing would force that man into the open. The photograph belonged to Charles Whitaker, a 67-year-old billionaire whose name appeared on buildings, university programs, charity foundations, and political fundraising events across the state. For years, Charles Whitaker had cultivated the image of a respectable businessman. He donated millions to hospitals. He funded scholarships. He appeared at charity galas beside governors and judges. He had even received a Civic Leadership Award for his contributions to the community. But investigators discovered something hidden beneath that reputation. 20 years earlier, Whitaker had owned the company that controlled the private warehouse where the evidence had been temporarily stored. The victim had worked as an accountant for one of his subsidiaries. And 3 weeks before her death, she had discovered millions of dollars moving through accounts connected to Whitaker's companies. She had confronted him. Then she had contacted a journalist. That journalist never received the documents. The victim was murdered. Marcus was framed. And the investigation disappeared. For 20 years, Whitaker had continued building his empire. But the investigators now had something he couldn't buy. A recording, a financial trail, and 4 witnesses who could connect him to the operation. Still, they needed proof that Whitaker personally ordered Marcus to be framed. That proof came from an unexpected place. An old private flight record. The night before the murder, Whitaker's aircraft had landed less than 30 miles from the secret parking garage where Richard Vale had met Whitmore and Price. Whitaker claimed he had been in another state. The flight records proved otherwise. His alibi was collapsing, and investigators were finally ready to confront him. Charles Whitaker agreed to meet investigators. He arrived with 2 attorneys. He wore an expensive charcoal suit and walked into the interview room with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. The investigators asked where he had been 20 years earlier. Whitaker answered immediately. He said he had been attending a private business retreat in Colorado. They showed him the flight records. He dismissed them. They showed him the aircraft's fuel records. He remained calm. Then they showed him a photograph taken at a private airfield on the night before the murder. Whitaker was visible in the background. His expression changed. Only slightly. But the investigators noticed. They asked whether he knew Thomas Whitmore. Whitaker said they had met professionally. They asked whether he knew Alina Price. He said he had met her once. Then they asked about Richard Vale. Whitaker leaned back. He said he had never heard the name. That answer lasted less than 30 seconds. Because investigators immediately placed the recovered audio recording in front of him. They did not play it. They simply told him they had it. For the first time, Whitaker stopped speaking. The investigator told him that the recording placed his associates together on the night before the murder. Whitaker asked what they wanted. The investigator answered that they wanted the truth. Whitaker smiled. He said truth was expensive. Then the investigator replied that Marcus Reed had already paid the price. The room went silent. Whitaker's expression hardened. And for the first time, the billionaire looked afraid. Whitaker refused to confess. Instead, his attorneys attacked the investigation. They argued that financial associations proved nothing. They argued that the recording had not yet been authenticated. They argued that Richard Vale was unreliable. And technically, they were right. The investigators needed more. So they followed the money again. This time, they found something extraordinary. One of Whitaker's companies had made a payment to a consulting firm 48 hours after Marcus was convicted. The consulting firm had no employees, no office, no legitimate business activity. Its only purpose appeared to be receiving money. Investigators traced the account. The money moved again. Then again. Eventually, it reached a private trust. The trust belonged to Thomas Whitmore. But there was another transfer. A smaller one. Sent to Alina Price. Then another. Sent to Daniel Mercer. The operation had been financed from the top. But the final transfer contained something even more important. A payment to Richard Vale. The description was only a string of numbers. Investigators compared those numbers with the original case file. They matched an evidence control code. That meant the payment had not simply been money for silence. It had been connected to the evidence itself. The case had now reached the point where coincidence was no longer a reasonable explanation. Whitaker's money had funded the operation. Whitmore had coordinated it. Price had helped manipulate the evidence. Mercer had presented the resulting case. And Richard had transported the evidence. But investigators still needed one final piece. Who actually killed the victim? Because framing Marcus and committing the murder were not necessarily the same act. And the recovered recording had captured the answer. The forensic team returned to the original recording. They isolated the final 30 seconds. At first, there was nothing but static. Then came footsteps. The victim screamed. A man's voice shouted. And then the recording captured the sound of another person entering the room. Investigators compared the voice against every known suspect. Whitmore, Mercer, Price, Whitaker. None matched conclusively. Then they compared it against one more person. A former security employee who had worked for Whitaker 20 years earlier. His name was Frank Dalton. Dalton had never appeared in Marcus's trial. He had never been questioned. And he had never been listed as a suspect. But his voice matched. Investigators searched his employment history. Dalton had been Whitaker's personal security chief at the time. He had also been present at the private warehouse. And his phone records placed him near the victim's building on the night of the murder. The final piece fell into place. Whitaker had wanted the victim silenced. Whitmore had arranged the judicial protection. Price had helped manipulate the evidence. Mercer had built the prosecution. Richard had transported the evidence. And Frank Dalton had carried out the murder. Marcus had simply been the man they sacrificed to make the crime disappear. But there was one more twist. Dalton was already dead. He had died 8 years earlier, which meant the investigators could never prosecute him. But before his death, Dalton had left something behind. A private journal. And inside that journal was the final confirmation. Frank Dalton's journal was not a confession. At least not directly. It was a record of payments, dates, locations, names, and coded instructions. The investigators spent 2 days decoding it. One entry was dated 3 days before the murder. Another was dated the morning Marcus was arrested. Then they found the sentence that finally connected everything. Dalton had written that Whitaker had ordered the victim's death because she possessed financial records capable of destroying his business empire. He wrote that Marcus Reed had been selected because he had unknowingly been placed near the scene. He wrote that evidence would be planted. He wrote that the prosecutor would handle the rest. And finally, he recorded something that made the investigators stop breathing. Dalton wrote that Judge Victoria Hale was never told the truth. She had not been part of the conspiracy. She had been used. The evidence had been carefully constructed so that every piece presented to her appeared legitimate. The people behind the scheme had counted on one thing: that the judge would trust the evidence placed before her. And she had. For 20 years, Victoria Hale had believed she had sentenced a guilty man. Now she knew she had been manipulated too. But the journal contained one final entry. It was written years after Marcus's conviction. Dalton had apparently become afraid that the truth would eventually surface. He wrote that if anything happened to him, the evidence should be found. Then he named the person he believed had been responsible for keeping the conspiracy alive. Not Whitaker. Not Whitmore. Not Price. Someone else. Someone still alive. Someone who had access to the original case file. Someone who had quietly destroyed every attempt to reopen Marcus's conviction for nearly 20 years. The name shocked everyone, because that person was still working inside the justice system. And Marcus's freedom was now closer than ever. But before he could walk out of prison, Victoria Hale would have to confront the person who had helped bury the truth. The investigators stared at the final name in Frank Dalton's journal. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The person who had quietly interfered with Marcus Reed's appeals for almost 20 years was Samuel Grant, the former deputy clerk responsible for restricted criminal records. Grant had worked directly beneath Judge Thomas Whitmore. After Marcus's conviction, Grant had been promoted, then promoted again. Eventually, he became the senior administrator responsible for archival access to several sensitive cases, including Marcus's. Investigators immediately pulled his employment records. The pattern was disturbing. Every time Marcus's family had requested access to the original evidence, Grant had been involved. Every time a lawyer had requested a review, Grant had processed the paperwork. And in several instances, documents had mysteriously gone missing. At first, those incidents had looked like administrative mistakes. Now they looked deliberate. Investigators searched Grant's home. They found boxes of old courthouse records. Among them were copies of documents that should never have left the courthouse. Then they discovered something even more disturbing. Grant had received regular payments from a company controlled by Charles Whitaker for nearly 18 years. The payments were small enough to avoid immediate attention, but they were consistent, month after month, year after year. Grant had not built the conspiracy. He had protected it. Whenever someone came close to discovering the truth, he made the paperwork disappear. Whenever an appeal threatened to reopen the case, he delayed it. Marcus had spent 20 years behind bars partly because one man kept closing the door every time someone tried to open it. Now investigators had finally found the man holding the key, and they were coming for him. Samuel Grant answered the door himself. He was 70 years old. He looked ordinary. That was what made the discovery so disturbing. There was no mansion, no extravagant lifestyle, no obvious sign that millions of dollars had passed through accounts connected to him. His house was modest. His clothes were simple. His neighbors described him as quiet and polite. But when investigators entered the house with a warrant, they discovered a locked room at the back. Inside were boxes, hundreds of them, old court documents, appeal requests, evidence inventories, correspondence from Marcus's mother, letters from attorneys, requests for new hearings. Some documents had never reached the judges they were addressed to. Others had been marked as incomplete. Some had been returned with false administrative explanations. The investigators found a file containing Marcus's earliest appeal. It had been stamped as received, but there was no record that it had ever been forwarded. Grant had kept it for 20 years. When confronted, Grant initially denied everything. He said he had only followed administrative instructions. The investigators asked who gave him those instructions. Grant refused to answer. Then they showed him the financial records. His face changed. They showed him the journal. His hands began to shake. Finally, he admitted that he had been paid to delay the appeals. But he insisted he had never known Marcus was innocent. He claimed he believed the original conviction was legitimate. The investigators asked whether he had ever opened the evidence files. Grant said yes. Then they asked why he continued hiding them after seeing inconsistencies. Grant looked down. He said there were some questions it was safer not to ask. Victoria Hale asked to speak with Samuel Grant. The investigators warned her that she didn't have to. She insisted. They met in a private courthouse conference room. Victoria sat across from the man who had helped keep her old verdict buried. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Victoria asked him one question. "Did you know?" Grant looked at her. Victoria asked whether he knew Marcus Reed might have been innocent. Grant said he didn't know. Victoria reminded him that he had handled the appeal documents. He said he had only followed orders. Victoria asked whose orders. Grant remained silent. She leaned forward. Her voice remained calm. She told him that 20 years ago she had believed she was protecting the public. She had believed the evidence. She had believed the prosecution. She had believed the system. Now she wanted to know whether the system had ever believed in her. Grant finally looked away. He admitted that Whitmore had instructed him to keep the case closed. But he insisted that Whitmore had not acted alone. Victoria asked who else knew. Grant hesitated. Then he said something Victoria never expected. He told her that one person had known about the manipulation from the very beginning. Someone who had attended every major hearing. Someone who had quietly advised her during the original case. Someone Victoria trusted. Victoria's expression froze. She asked for the name. Grant refused. He said naming that person would put him in danger. Victoria told him that the danger had already arrived. Then Grant slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Victoria opened it. The name was written there. She stared at it. And for the first time, she realized the conspiracy had reached much closer to her than she had ever imagined. Victoria unfolded the paper. The name was Richard Bennett, her former mentor, the senior judge who had advised her during the Marcus Reed case, the man who had taught her that judges should never allow emotion to interfere with evidence, the man she had trusted for decades. Victoria remembered him sitting behind her during the trial. She remembered him whispering advice. She remembered asking him whether the prosecution's evidence seemed sufficient. He had told her yes. Now she wondered whether that answer had been part of the plan. Investigators searched Bennett's old financial records. They discovered that, shortly after Marcus's conviction, Bennett had received a large transfer from a foundation connected to Charles Whittaker. The payment had been disguised as a charitable contribution. But it was not the only one. There had been another payment years later. Then another. And another. Bennett had been receiving money for nearly 2 decades. But there was still no direct proof that he had participated in the murder. Then investigators found a handwritten note from Frank Dalton. It described a meeting before the murder. Whittaker, Whitmore, Price, Dalton, and one additional person, Richard Bennett. The meeting had been about Marcus. They had discussed his route, his background, his financial situation, even his relationship with his mother. They had studied him before he ever knew he was being watched. Marcus had not been chosen randomly. He had been researched, selected, prepared, and positioned. The entire conviction had been constructed around a man who didn't even know he was part of the plan. But there was still one final question. Why was Marcus so valuable as a scapegoat? The answer was buried in his family history. And when investigators uncovered it, they discovered Marcus had been connected to the victim long before that night. The connection was hidden inside an old family record. The victim had once worked with Marcus's father. Not professionally, personally. Years before Marcus was born, His father had discovered irregularities in Whitaker's business operations. He had confronted the company. Then he had disappeared from the company's records. Marcus's father eventually left the industry, but he had kept copies of several financial documents. Documents the victim had later discovered. That was the real reason Marcus had been selected. He was not simply an innocent stranger who happened to be nearby. His family had unknowingly possessed information connected to Whitaker's financial network. The victim had known Marcus's father. She knew his family. She knew that Marcus had no idea what his father had discovered. And that made Marcus the perfect target. If he were arrested, nobody would immediately connect the case to the old financial records. If he were convicted, the investigation would end. And if he spent the rest of his life in prison, the secret would remain buried. Marcus finally learned the truth. His mother told him she remembered the victim's name. She had met her years earlier. She had even spoken to her about Marcus's father. Marcus sat silently. For 20 years, he had believed his life had been destroyed by a terrible coincidence. Now he understood. His imprisonment had been planned. His innocence had never mattered to the people who framed him. But they had made one mistake. They underestimated how long the truth could survive. The court was now preparing to issue its decision. Victoria Hale would testify. Richard Vale would testify. Samuel Grant would testify. And Marcus would finally stand before the court without the burden of being treated as a convicted murderer. But before the verdict could be overturned, Charles Whitaker made one final move. And this time, he wasn't trying to protect himself. He was trying to destroy the evidence. 3 days before the emergency hearing, something happened that almost destroyed the entire case. The original evidence archive was accessed after midnight. The person who entered the facility used legitimate credentials. There was no forced door, no broken lock, no alarm. Whoever entered knew exactly where to go. Security footage showed a figure wearing a dark maintenance uniform walking through the restricted corridor. The person reached the evidence room. They opened the storage cabinet containing Marcus Reed's original case materials. Then they removed one box. Only one. The box containing the original forensic evidence. The person carried it toward the service elevator. But they never reached the exit. A security officer unexpectedly entered the corridor. The figure dropped the box and ran. By the time investigators arrived, the person was gone. But the box remained. And something was missing. A single evidence envelope. The envelope containing the original laboratory report. The report that had supposedly connected Marcus to the crime. Investigators immediately realized what had happened. Someone wasn't trying to destroy evidence against Marcus. They were trying to remove the evidence that could prove the evidence against him had been fabricated. That missing envelope could contain the final answer. The defense attorney demanded every surviving copy. One copy was located in an old state archive. Another existed in a prosecutor's personal case file. And a third had been scanned into a judicial database. The investigators compared them. The documents were not identical. One contained an additional laboratory notation. That notation had been removed from the version presented at Marcus's trial. And it changed the meaning of the forensic evidence completely. Marcus had never been scientifically connected to the murder. The connection had been manufactured. The defense attorney placed the 3 versions of the laboratory report side by side. The first was the copy used at trial. The second came from the prosecutor's private archive. The third came from the state database. The differences were small. A missing paragraph, a changed notation, a laboratory reference number. But those tiny differences mattered. The original forensic analyst had written that the physical evidence was inconclusive. It did not establish that Marcus had handled the weapon. It did not establish that Marcus had been inside the victim's home. And it did not establish that the biological material belonged to him. The prosecution's trial copy had presented the evidence differently. The uncertainty had disappeared. The defense attorney stared at the documents. Then he noticed something else. The laboratory analyst's signature appeared on the original report. But the signature on the trial version had been digitally reproduced. 20 years ago, digital manipulation of evidence had been far less sophisticated. Someone had altered the report, and the person who authorized the alteration had signed the evidence control form. The name was Daniel Mercer, the former prosecutor who had built the case against Marcus. But Mercer was already cooperating with investigators. When confronted with the document, he finally admitted what he had done. He said Whitaker's people had pressured him. He said he believed Marcus was innocent. But he had convinced himself that protecting his career was more important than questioning the case. He had told himself that the system would eventually correct itself. It never did. Instead, Marcus lost 20 years. Mercer lowered his head. He said there was something else. Something he had never admitted. The person who ordered him to alter the laboratory evidence was not Whitaker. It was Richard Bennett, the judge who had advised Victoria Hale. And suddenly, Victoria's entire memory of Marcus's trial began collapsing. Victoria Hale returned to the old courtroom alone. The room was empty. The same wooden benches. The same judge's bench. The same witness stand. But everything felt different. She remembered Marcus standing before her 20 years earlier. She remembered his expression. She remembered his mother crying. She remembered the evidence placed before her. At the time, she had believed the evidence was overwhelming. Now she understood that the people responsible had carefully constructed an illusion of certainty. Victoria walked toward the witness stand. She placed one hand on the wooden rail. For the first time in her career, she allowed herself to confront a question she had spent 20 years avoiding. What if the system she trusted had been manipulated from inside? The answer was painful. But there was another realization. Victoria herself had not been the final judge in Marcus's story. She had been one of its victims. The people responsible had used her reputation to give their fabricated evidence legitimacy. Her signature had made the lie look like justice. Now she had a choice. She could protect her reputation, or she could tell the truth. Victoria picked up the phone. She called the defense attorney. She told him she wanted to testify. Not as a judge. Not as Marcus's former sentencing judge. But as the person who had unknowingly delivered the verdict that destroyed his life. And she had one thing to say under oath. She had been wrong. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. Marcus was brought into the courthouse, wearing the same orange prison uniform he had worn for years. But this time, something was different. The courtroom was full. Reporters crowded the back rows. Family members filled the benches. Investigators stood near the wall. And for the first time in 20 years, Marcus's mother sat close enough to see her son without prison glass between them. Marcus entered quietly. He looked toward her. She smiled through tears. Then the doors opened again. Victoria Hale entered. The room fell silent. She was no longer presiding over the case. She was there to testify, The defense attorney stood. He told the court that new evidence had established that the original conviction was fundamentally compromised. The prosecution objected. They argued that the evidence required further examination. The judge listened. Then Victoria took the witness stand. She swore to tell the truth. The defense attorney asked whether she had sentenced Marcus Reed 20 years earlier. She said yes. He asked whether she believed he was guilty at the time. She said yes. Then he asked whether she still believed that. Victoria looked directly at Marcus. She said no. The courtroom became completely silent. She told the court that she had trusted evidence that had been manipulated. She admitted that she had unknowingly become part of a process designed to make a false conviction appear legitimate. Marcus lowered his head. His mother covered her mouth. Victoria continued. She said Marcus had deserved a fair trial. He had never received one. And now the court had a responsibility to correct what had been done. Then the defense attorney placed the original laboratory report before the judge. The document that had been hidden for 20 years. The room went silent again. Because this time, the truth was sitting directly in front of the court. The judge reviewed the evidence for several minutes. Then he looked toward the prosecution. The prosecutor stood. He said the state could no longer defend the original conviction. Those words seemed to hang in the courtroom. 20 years. One sentence. One man. And finally, an admission that the system had failed him. The judge turned toward Marcus. He said the court had found overwhelming evidence that the original conviction could not stand. Marcus remained still. The judge continued. He formally vacated the conviction. Marcus was no longer legally a murderer. He was no longer a prisoner. He was free. For a moment, Marcus didn't move. Then his mother reached him. They embraced. Marcus held her tightly. She cried against his shoulder. He whispered that he was sorry. She told him there was nothing to apologize for. He had survived. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded the family. Cameras flashed. Questions came from every direction. But Marcus ignored them. He looked up at the courthouse building. 20 years earlier, he had entered that building as a young man believing the truth would protect him. He left it 20 years later, knowing something different. Truth does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it arrives after careers have ended, after reputations have collapsed, after families have aged, after years that can never be returned. But when it finally arrives, it can still change everything. Marcus Reed walked away from the courthouse that morning without guards beside him, without handcuffs, without an orange uniform. For the first time in 20 years, he was simply a free man. And somewhere behind those courthouse doors, Victoria Hale remained alone for a moment. She looked at the empty courtroom, then at the old case file, and she finally understood the lesson Marcus's case had forced her to learn. Justice isn't simply about believing the evidence. Sometimes, justice means having the courage to admit when the evidence itself was a lie. Marcus stepped through the courthouse doors and stopped. The sunlight felt different. For 20 years, every outdoor moment had been controlled by someone else. A correctional officer had decided when he could walk. A prison schedule had decided when he could eat. A locked door had decided when he could sleep. Now nobody was telling him where to go. He stood on the courthouse steps and simply breathed. His mother came beside him. She looked older than the woman who had entered the courtroom 20 years earlier. Marcus looked at her gray hair. She looked at his face. Neither needed to say what they were thinking. They had lost 20 years, but they had found each other again. Reporters shouted questions. Marcus declined every interview. He wasn't ready to explain his life to strangers. He simply walked down the steps beside his mother. For the first time since his arrest, there was no prison vehicle waiting for him. No officer. No locked gate. Only an ordinary city street. And somehow, that ordinary street felt like the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. The consequences came quickly. Charles Whitaker was arrested on multiple federal charges. His companies were investigated. Bank accounts were frozen. Properties were searched. The empire he had spent decades building began collapsing within weeks. Thomas Whitmore was stripped of his judicial privileges and faced criminal charges. Daniel Mercer entered a cooperation agreement and admitted his role in manipulating the prosecution. Samuel Grant pleaded guilty to illegally suppressing court records. Richard Vail agreed to testify. Eleanor Price disappeared from public life after investigators uncovered her involvement. And Richard Bennett, the respected former judge who had once advised Victoria Hale, was forced to answer for his role in the conspiracy. For years, Bennett had presented himself as a defender of judicial integrity. Now investigators had evidence showing that he had helped corrupt the very system he claimed to protect. The story became national news. But Marcus barely watched it. He had spent 20 years watching other people control his story. He didn't want to spend another day doing it. He wanted something simpler. A home. A job. A morning where he could wake up without counting the years. A life that belonged to him. 3 weeks later, Marcus woke up before sunrise. For 20 years, waking early had meant prison. A loud announcement. Metal doors. Footsteps in the corridor. A schedule. This morning, there was none of that. He opened his bedroom window. Birds were outside. Cars moved along the street. Somewhere nearby, someone was making coffee. Marcus stood there for several minutes. He realized something strange. He didn't know what to do next. Freedom sounded simple when you were imprisoned. But freedom came with decisions. Where should he live? What work could he do? How could he rebuild a career at 38 after losing his 20s? How could he trust people again? How could he sleep without expecting a guard to wake him? The psychological scars were deeper than anyone could see. His mother found him sitting silently at the kitchen table. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him. She told him he didn't have to rebuild everything at once. Marcus smiled. She was right. He had spent 20 years being told what he couldn't do. Now he was going to learn how to choose. He started small. He took long walks. He learned how to use a smartphone that was far more advanced than anything he remembered. He visited a grocery store alone. He stood in the middle of the aisle for almost a minute because he couldn't believe he could simply choose what he wanted and leave. It sounds insignificant. It sounds insignificant. But to Marcus, it was freedom. Several months later, Victoria Hale visited Marcus. Not at the courthouse. Not in a prison. At a small community center where Marcus had begun volunteering. He was helping young people who had experienced difficult circumstances. Victoria watched him speaking to a group of teenagers. She waited until the room emptied. Then she approached. Marcus recognized her immediately. For a moment, neither knew what to say. Victoria apologized. Not as a judge. Not as a former judge. As a human being. She told Marcus that she had replayed his case in her mind hundreds of times. She had wondered whether she could have seen the lie sooner. Marcus told her something she wasn't expecting. He said that blaming herself wouldn't give him those 20 years back. Victoria looked at him. Marcus said the people responsible had already taken enough from him. He didn't want to let them take the rest of his life too. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She thanked him. Marcus told her he wasn't forgiving what happened. He was simply refusing to remain trapped inside it. That distinction stayed with Victoria, because Marcus had lost 20 years to a conspiracy. But he refused to lose another 20 to bitterness. But the story wasn't completely finished. 1 year after Marcus's release, investigators reopened the original evidence archive one final time. They were reviewing the case for a federal report when they discovered something nobody had noticed. A second storage number. It had been written underneath the original evidence box. The number corresponded to another archive. Inside that archive was a sealed envelope. It contained a photograph. The photograph had been taken 20 years earlier. Marcus was standing outside his workplace. The victim was visible in the background. But that wasn't what shocked investigators. Standing beside the victim was Charles Whittaker. And beside Whittaker was Richard Bennett. The photograph had been taken 6 months before the murder. That meant the two men had known the victim long before the prosecution claimed. It also meant something else. Marcus had been watched for months before the murder. He hadn't been selected because he happened to be nearby. He had been selected because someone had already studied his life. His family, his father's history, his relationship with the victim. Everything. The conspiracy had been planned long before Marcus ever entered that courtroom. And perhaps the most chilling discovery was the date written on the back of the photograph. It was dated almost exactly 1 year before Marcus's arrest. The people responsible hadn't improvised. They had planned. They had waited. And they had trusted that the truth would never survive long enough to expose them. They were wrong. Because 20 years later, one forgotten piece of evidence had done what 20 years of silence could not. It had opened the door. And once that door opened, everything behind it came into the light. Marcus never got his 20 years back. Nobody could give him that. But he got something else. His name, his freedom, and the truth. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive when we expect it. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes decades. But when the truth finally refuses to stay buried, even 20 years of lies can collapse in a single day. Marcus Reed lost 20 years to a lie. But he refused to give the truth another day. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. The next truth is waiting.